Case 1. Nydia Yalabeth Alvarado. December 23, 2013. San Antonio, Texas. There are moments in the work of law enforcement that leave a permanent mark. Not because of the complexity of the investigation, not because of the years it took to solve, but because of the sheer weight of what was found and what it meant. For the workers arriving for an ordinary shift at a waste management recycling facility on the northeast side of San Antonio on the morning of December 23, 2013, that ordinary morning would become something none of them would ever be able to forget. It was the kind of day that starts like any other. Machines running, conveyor belts moving, the steady mechanical rhythm of a facility doing what it was designed to do, sorting through what the city had discarded and finding what could still be saved. And then, on the intake conveyor belt, a worker saw something that made everything stop. A blue duffel bag, sitting still among the debris. Unremarkable at first glance. But something about it, something unspoken, something that defies easy explanation, made a worker pause. What was inside that bag would bring San Antonio Police Sergeant Javier Salazar to the scene, would trigger a capital murder investigation, and would place the name of a 25-year-old woman named Nydia Yalabeth Alvarado at the center of one of the most heartbreaking cases the city had seen in years. Inside that bag was a baby boy. He was estimated to be less than a week old. He had no name. He had never been given one. And according to investigators, he had been alive, however briefly, outside the walls of a hospital before his life was taken from him in the most vulnerable days of his existence. To understand how a child so new to the world ended up discarded on a recycling belt just 2 days before Christmas, investigators had to trace back the decisions, the circumstances, and the desperation that surrounded his short life. Nydia Alvarado had given birth to the baby boy at a San Antonio hospital. According to police records and court documents, she had registered at the facility under an assumed name, a detail that would later suggest a level of deliberate concealment that investigators found deeply troubling. She had reportedly been attempting in the weeks prior to his birth to find someone who could help her in the pregnancy, having been unable to access formal medical services to do so. When that proved impossible, she gave birth at the hospital, signed paperwork under a name that was not her own, and left with the infant in her arms. She did not take him to a police station. She did not take him to a fire station. She did not avail herself of Texas's safe haven law, known formally as the Baby Moses Law, which allows a parent to surrender a newborn infant, no questions asked, to any designated emergency employee within 60 days of birth. That law exists precisely for moments like the one Nydia Alvarado was facing. It was designed as a lifeline, a legal and compassionate alternative that has saved countless infant lives across the state of Texas since its passage. But Nydia did not reach for that lifeline. What happened next is documented in the arrest affidavit filed by San Antonio police. According to investigators, after returning to her apartment, Nydia Alvarado used a ligature, a cord or similar binding, to end the life of her newborn son. She later told investigators that she heard him make a sound as he struggled for breath, and that she stayed with him until he no longer moved. She then placed his body inside a blue duffel bag and carried it to a dumpster outside her apartment building, discarding him among the ordinary refuse of the day. The dumpster's contents made their way, as they always did, to the waste management recycling facility. And that is where, on the morning of December 23, 2013, the baby boy was found. Sergeant Javier Salazar stood before reporters that day and struggled to find words equal to what had been discovered. He spoke not as a law enforcement official delivering a briefing, but as a human being confronted by something that shook him to his core. It should never get to a situation, he said, where you throw out a child like it was common trash. If something happened that you couldn't care for the child, you could take the child to a police station. Those words did not read as a prepared statement. They read as a man pleading, retroactively, uselessly, heartbreakingly, for a different choice to have been made. Investigators moved quickly. The evidence left at the scene, combined with hospital records, surveillance footage, and the registered name on the hospital paperwork, pointed toward Nydia Alvarado. When detectives arrived at her apartment on the night of January 14, 2014, she was taken into custody. Inside the apartment, officers discovered 2 other young children, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, who were turned over to Child Protective Services while investigators determined their parentage and safety. Nydia Alvarado was charged with capital murder. Her bond was set at $2 million. A capital murder charge in Texas, when applied to the killing of a child, carries the possibility of the death penalty. It is the most serious charge the state of Texas can bring. And yet, in the years that followed her arrest, the case would navigate through the legal system not toward a dramatic courtroom trial, but toward a moment of legal resolution that arrived quietly, formally, and with a weight that no resolution could ever fully carry. In October of 2016, Nydia Alvarado entered a guilty plea, not to capital murder, but to murder. As part of that plea, she was sentenced to life in prison. The charge reduction reflected prosecutorial considerations that are common in cases where a plea avoids the cost and emotional burden of a full capital trial. But the outcome was still categorical and permanent. Nydia Alvarado would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Present in the courtroom that day was a woman named Pamela Allen, the founder of Eagles Flight Advocacy and Outreach, a San Antonio organization dedicated to advocating for victims of violent crime. She had been following the case since its earliest days, and she wore a charm bracelet on her wrist with a small memorial for the baby who had never been given a name. He would have been 3 years old in December, she told reporters outside the courthouse. I carry him with me always. Behar County District Attorney Nico LaHood, speaking after the sentencing, offered words that cut straight to the core of what the case represented. When you think of a 3-day-old child that's completely innocent, he said, it shocks your conscience. It shocks it not just because of what was done, but because of what could have been done instead. Because the alternative existed. Because there was a choice, a legal, compassionate, consequence-free choice, that was not made. The baby boy found in that blue duffel bag was never officially named. His mother did not give him a name. The state of Texas did not assign him one in official records. But those who followed the case, the advocates, the investigators, the journalists who covered it year after year, carried him in their memories. He was 3 days old. He weighed what a newborn weighs. He had never felt sunlight, never heard his name called, never had the chance to become anything. And yet his brief, unnamed existence changed the lives of everyone who encountered it. In Texas, the Baby Moses Safe Haven program remains one of the most powerful tools available for parents in crisis. Since its establishment, it has been responsible for saving the lives of hundreds of newborns who might otherwise have faced the same fate as the child found on that conveyor belt in December of 2013. Safe Haven baby boxes, secure, climate-controlled units attached to fire stations and other emergency facilities, have been installed across the state to make surrender as simple and anonymous as possible. No paperwork, no questions, no consequences. Just a safe place for a baby to land when a parent cannot find another way forward. That system existed when Nydia Alvarado walked out of that hospital. It was there, and it was not used. The legacy of this case lives in that gap, the space between the choice that was made and the choice that was available. Law enforcement officers, child advocacy groups, and community organizations across San Antonio have used the story of this unnamed baby boy as a reminder of why those resources exist, why they must be publicized, and why every parent, no matter their circumstance, their fear, or their desperation, must know that there is always another way. For the baby boy found in a blue duffel bag on December 23, 2013, justice arrived in October of 2016 in the form of a life sentence. It was not the ending that anyone wanted for a story that should never have had to begin, but it was accountability. And in the language of a justice system that deals daily with the worst of human behavior, accountability is the closest thing to closure that can be offered to the voiceless. He deserved more than what he got. He deserved a name. He deserved a chance. He deserved every birthday he never had. What he got instead was a blue duffel bag, a conveyor belt, and a city that remembered him long after the cameras left. If you or someone you know is facing a crisis pregnancy or an overwhelming situation involving a newborn, please know that Texas's Baby Moses Safe Haven law allows any parent to safely surrender a baby under 60 days old to any emergency personnel, fire station, hospital, or police station, with no questions asked and no legal consequences. You are not alone, and help is always available. If this case moved you, if you believe that every child deserves to be seen, to be valued, and to be protected, then take a moment right now to show your support. Hit that like button, leave a comment below, and make sure you subscribe to Cold Case Time so you never miss another story. Every click helps this channel continue telling the stories that matter most. Case 2. Marlene Vidal. May 15, 2026. San Antonio, Texas. There are cases that arrive without warning. Cases that break not at the end of a long investigation, not after years of courtroom proceedings, but in the earliest hours of a single morning, when the city is still dark and the streets are still quiet, and something terrible has already happened before most people have opened their eyes. May 15, 2026, was one of those mornings in San Antonio. It began before sunrise. It began with smoke. Somewhere between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, a person walking their dog in the area of Richland Hills Drive on the city's far west side noticed something that did not belong in the pre-dawn quiet of that neighborhood. A vehicle was on fire. Not smoldering, not beginning to catch, but actively burning. A white Hyundai sedan, fully engulfed, sending smoke into the early morning sky near a warehouse parking lot not far from the intersection of State Highway 151 and Loop 410. The person walking their dog stopped. They looked, and in the light of that burning vehicle, they saw something else, a woman standing nearby. The woman told the passerby that she had already contacted authorities, but the passerby reached for their phone anyway and called 911 themselves. When San Antonio fire crews and police officers arrived and extinguished the blaze, they approached the vehicle and made a discovery that SAPD Assistant Chief Jesse Salami would later describe in a press conference as something the entire community would struggle to process. Inside that burned white Hyundai, investigators found the bodies of 2 children. They were siblings. A girl, 7 years old. A boy, 5 years old. The younger child was autistic and nonverbal. The woman who had been standing at the scene when authorities arrived identified herself to officers as the children's mother. Her name was Marlene Vidal. She was 34 years old, from Edinburgh, Texas, a city in the Rio Grande Valley, far south of San Antonio. She had family connections in the city, which investigators believed explained her presence there. She told officers that the children had lived with her in Edinburgh, that they were hers, and that she was the one authorities would be looking for. That statement, "She was the one authorities would be looking for," was not phrased like an explanation. It was phrased like a confession. And in the hours that followed, as investigators reviewed surveillance footage from cameras near the warehouse, gathered physical evidence from the scene, and documented the statements Vidal had already made, the picture that emerged was not one of accident or tragedy by circumstance. It was one of deliberate, premeditated action by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect those 2 children above all others. SAPD Assistant Chief Jesse Salami stated at the morning press conference that statements from Vidal, combined with the surveillance footage and the evidence gathered at the scene, indicated that she was solely responsible for the deaths of her 2 children. He confirmed that Marlene Vidal had been taken into custody and charged with capital murder, the most serious charge in the Texas Penal Code. "It's difficult for our entire community to have to deal with this," Salami said. "It's tragic on so many angles. It's hard for us to really put into words how this impacts all of our community." He was right. There are some crimes that resist language. Not because the facts are unclear or the investigation is incomplete, but because the human mind recoils from certain combinations of circumstances. A mother, her children, a burning vehicle, an early morning, a dog walker, a phone call, 2 small bodies. The details of what happened inside that vehicle in the hours or minutes before that fire began remain part of an active investigation that was still developing at the time of this documentary. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office was working to formally identify the children and determine the official cause and manner of their passing. Arson investigators were also examining the vehicle to determine the precise origin and nature of the fire. But the overarching finding, that Marlene Vidal was solely responsible for what happened to her children on that morning, was confirmed by law enforcement from the earliest hours of the case. The children's father, who lived in the Rio Grande Valley and was no longer living with Vidal, spoke with reporters in the aftermath of the discovery. He described being devastated. He confirmed that the younger child, his 5-year-old son, had autism and had communication limitations that made him particularly vulnerable. He had not lived with the family in some time. and investigators were working to understand the full picture of the household dynamics and the circumstances that preceded the events of May 15th. KSAT reported that Bihar County and Hidalgo County databases had no record of prior criminal charges against Marlene Vidal before this case. She had no known history of involvement with law enforcement. What investigators found instead was a woman who, by all outward appearances, had been living an ordinary life in Edinburgh until the morning she drove to San Antonio and arrived at a warehouse parking lot on Richland Hills Drive with her 2 children. Assistant Chief Salami addressed the question of motive carefully and honestly. We don't yet have a clear motive. However, there are indications that mental health issues may have played a role. That is something investigators are working hard to better understand. Mental health as a factor in cases of this nature is not a mitigating excuse. It is not an automatic defense. It is a variable that courts, juries, and mental health professionals examine with great care and rigor within the bounds of the legal system. What that examination yields, in terms of criminal responsibility, competency, and the application of the law, is a process that takes months and years, not hours and days. Marlene Vidal's case, as of the time of this documentary, remained in its earliest investigative stages, with the weight of a capital murder charge and the grief of a community pressing against every development. The 7-year-old girl and the 5-year-old boy found inside that burned Hyundai on Richland Hills Drive had names. They were real children who had lived real lives, who had been cared for and known and loved by people beyond their mother. They went to sleep somewhere and woke up somewhere and existed in the world with the full, undiminished weight of human lives. That they lost those lives on a May morning in a warehouse parking lot in a city that was not their home is a fact that will follow this case through every legal proceeding, every hearing, and every year of whatever sentence ultimately follows. For the children, for the 7-year-old girl and her 5-year-old brother, this case is not about the law. It is not about capital murder charges or surveillance footage or arson investigations. It is about the 2 most fundamental things a child deserves from the person charged with their care, safety, and love. They deserve both. They should have had both. And the fact that they did not is the tragedy that will define this case for as long as it is remembered. Marlene Vidal was booked into the Bihar County Adult Detention Center, where she awaited the full weight of the legal process. Capital murder in Texas, upon conviction, carries a mandatory sentence of either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The investigation was ongoing, and the pursuit of justice for those 2 children was only beginning. If this case has stirred something in you, a need to speak, to grieve, to demand better for the children in our communities, we encourage you to reach out to the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI or text NAMI to 62640. Support exists for families in crisis, and asking for help is always the right call. If you are watching this on Cold Case Time, and this is your first time here, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps this channel continue bringing cases like this one to light and honoring the memories of children who deserve far better. We will never stop telling their stories. Case 3. Tiona Islar. September 20th, 2025. San Antonio, Texas. Some cases begin with a phone call. Some begin with a neighbor's concern, a passing witness, an anonymous tip. The case of Tiona Lasaisha Islar began with a mother's voice on a 911 line, reporting something that no parent should ever have to say, that her children were not breathing. And yet from the very first moments that Bihar County Sheriff's deputies arrived at a home on Chancery Gate in the Alamo Ranch area of far west San Antonio, something about the story they were being told did not line up with the evidence they were seeing. Sheriff Javier Salazar would stand before cameras within hours and say, plainly and without equivocation, something's not adding up with this case. It was a Saturday afternoon, September 20th, 2025. The temperature in San Antonio had climbed into the low 90s, the kind of heavy, relentless heat that defines Texas late summer, the kind that builds from morning and reaches its peak in the hours when the sun is highest and there is no shade deep enough to provide relief. In a vehicle sitting in direct sunlight on a day like that, temperatures inside the car can rise to dangerous, life-threatening levels within minutes. That scientific reality sits at the center of what happened to 6-year-old Savannah Stevenson and his 3-year-old sister Mayani Islar. Deputies were dispatched at approximately 3:25 in the afternoon to the home on Chancery Gate. When they arrived, they found the two children had already been brought inside the house by their mother, Tiona Islar, 28 years old. The children were unresponsive. A deputy, confronted with two children who were not breathing, made the desperate decision to attempt resuscitation on both children simultaneously, cycling between them, doing everything medically possible to bring them back. Emergency medical services arrived and continued those efforts. But it was too late. At 3:38 in the afternoon, Savani Stevenson and Mayani Islar were pronounced deceased. Tiona Islar told investigators that she had last seen both children alive inside the home at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning before she had gone to sleep. She said she woke up at around 3 in the afternoon, noticed the front door was open, and found her children unresponsive inside her vehicle. She brought them inside and called for help. On the surface, that account could be read as a tragic accident. A mother asleep, two young children wandering outside and finding their way into a hot, locked vehicle, unable to escape. Hot car deaths in Texas are not uncommon. They are heartbreaking, they are preventable, and they disproportionately claim the lives of children who do not yet have the physical or cognitive ability to let themselves out of a vehicle they should never have been in. The state of Texas has seen devastating losses of young lives to vehicular heat exposure over many summer seasons, and advocates have worked tirelessly to educate families about the dangers of leaving children unattended around vehicles. But what Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar communicated to reporters was not consistent with the picture of an accident waiting to be confirmed. It was the picture of an investigation with questions that needed answering before any conclusion could be drawn. There just are some inconsistencies with the story that were being given, Salazar told reporters. At present, I'm not too confident. I'm not confident enough to give you all that that's definitively what happened. Among the inconsistencies that investigators were examining, the timeline that Tiona Islar described involved a span of approximately 7 hours during which she was asleep and unaware of her children's whereabouts. That is a significant stretch of time. The question of how two young children, one of whom, Savani, was autistic and had specific care needs, could have exited a home, accessed a vehicle, and remained inside for a duration long enough to succumb to heat, without any indication being noticed, was a question that law enforcement could not yet answer with the explanation they had been given. Sheriff Salazar also confirmed that Child Protective Services had previously received calls related to the welfare of the Islar family, a detail that introduced the possibility of a prior pattern of concern that investigators would need to examine thoroughly as part of their case-building process. Tiona Islar was cooperative with investigators in the hours following the deaths of her children. Sheriff Salazar acknowledged that cooperation, while being equally clear that cooperation did not resolve the inconsistencies that had been identified. The following Monday, September 22nd, she was formally charged, 2 counts of injury to a child causing serious bodily injury or death. Her bond was set at $300,000. Savani Stevenson was 6 years old. He was autistic and nonverbal, which means he experienced the world differently, communicated differently, and required a level of attentive care that most parents of neurotypical children never have to think about. Mayani Islar was 3 years old. 3 years old. She was at the age when the world is just beginning to open up, when words are becoming sentences and sentences are becoming conversations, and every day brings something new to discover. Both children deserve the full weight of the protection that their age and their vulnerability demanded. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy to determine the official cause and manner of death for both children. Those findings would become critical evidence as investigators and prosecutors built their understanding of what actually happened on that September afternoon. As of the time this documentary was produced, the case remained under active investigation and had not yet proceeded to trial. What this case represents, regardless of its final legal determination, is a reminder of how acutely vulnerable young children are to circumstances they cannot control, cannot communicate about, and cannot escape from on their own. Whether those circumstances arise from negligence, from deliberate action, or from some combination of factors that only a full investigation can reveal, the outcome for Savani and Mayani was the same. They did not come home. They did not get another day. They did not get another chance. San Antonio is a city of enormous warmth, enormous community, and enormous heart. In the days after the deaths of Savannah and Mayani, neighbors in the Alamo Ranch area reached out to law enforcement, shared what they knew, and provided the kind of community-level cooperation that investigations depend on. The Bexar County Sheriff's Office asked anyone with video footage from the area of Chancery Gate and Appleton Way between 1 and 3:30 in the afternoon on that Saturday to come forward. That appeal to community witnesses speaks to the thoroughness of the investigation, to the commitment of law enforcement to leave no question unanswered in the pursuit of truth for two children who cannot speak for themselves. This case marks what was reported at the time as the 9th and 10th hot car-related child deaths in the state of Texas for the year 2025. A grim statistical milestone that underscores the ongoing public health crisis of child vehicular heat exposure. Nationally, advocates track these deaths with particular attention, noting that in any given year, dozens of children across the country lose their lives in this way. Organizations dedicated to preventing these tragedies, including nonprofit groups that develop and promote child vehicle safety technology and public education campaigns, work year-round to reduce that number. For Savannah and Mayani, those statistics are not statistics. They are names. They are faces. They are two children who lived on Chancery Gate in the Alamo Ranch area of San Antonio and who deserved every single day they did not get. The pursuit of justice in their case was ongoing. The investigation was thorough, and the community that surrounded them, even in grief, even in shock, refused to look away. If you want to honor the memories of Savannah and Mayani, the most powerful thing you can do is stay informed, stay engaged, and support the channels and organizations that refuse to let children become forgotten headlines. Hit the like button. Drop a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Time. These stories matter because these children matter, and they will never stop mattering on this channel. Case 4. Perucha Phillips. April 29, 2016. San Antonio, Texas. There are moments when the institutions that exist to protect the most vulnerable among us are given a chance to make a difference. And there are moments when those institutions succeed only after it is almost too late. The case that emerged from a home on Chipping Drive in northeast Bexar County in the early hours of April 29, 2016 began with a phone call about a child crying. Not an unusual sound. Not, on its own, a sound that signals catastrophe. Children cry. They cry at night. They cry in the morning. They cry for reasons that are easily explained and quickly resolved. But this crying had gone on long enough and had sounded distressed enough that someone in the neighborhood decided they could not simply wait for it to stop. That decision to call 911 may have been one of the most consequential acts of civic responsibility in the recent history of San Antonio's child protection system. Deputies from the Bexar County Sheriff's Office arrived just before midnight on a Friday. The home at 8105 Chipping Drive sat in a residential neighborhood on the northeast side of the county. What they found when they approached that property, when they made their way to the backyard and pointed their flashlights into the darkness, was something that Bexar County Sheriff's Office spokesman James Keith would later describe simply and devastatingly as a horrific case of child abuse. In the backyard of that home, they found two small children, not playing, not wandering, not simply unsupervised in the way that sometimes happens when parents are stretched thin and overwhelmed. These two children, a 2-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, were restrained. The boy had a metal chain strapped around his ankle, with the other end fixed to a spiral dog tether driven into the ground. Spokesman Keith described the setup in terms that have stayed with every person who heard them. It was the same kind of setup you would use for a dog. The 3-year-old girl was bound differently. Her hands were tied with a pink dog leash that was attached to an exterior door of the house. And while the full extent of what these children had endured in that backyard was still being assessed, the physical evidence was already speaking. The girl had a broken arm, fractured in 2 places. Investigators would later learn that she had pulled at her restraints so hard, for so long, that the force had caused the fractures. That detail, the image of a 3-year-old child straining against a leash until her bones gave way, was the detail that became the moral center of this case, the thing that people could not stop seeing when they closed their eyes. Both children were immediately taken to the hospital for treatment. But there was more. When deputies entered the home itself, they found 6 more children, all unsupervised, all unattended, ranging in age from 10 months to 13 years old. In a home that contained 8 children total, not one of them was being actively cared for in the middle of the night. The oldest was old enough to understand what was happening. The youngest was young enough to be entirely dependent on an adult for survival. And in that space between those two ages, in a house that should have been a safe place, a home place, a place where children were seen and fed and put to bed and checked on in the dark, there was a void where care should have been. 2 adults arrived at the scene later, identified as the parents of the 6 children found inside the house. Both were taken into custody for questioning. Investigators identified 34-year-old Parucha Phillips as the mother of those 6 children. She was also, according to authorities, the person responsible for looking after the 2 children found restrained outside, the boy and the girl who belonged to another household but had been placed in her care. The mother of those 2 restrained children was, at the time of the incident, in the state of California. That detail added another layer to a case that was already multidimensional in its complexity. The legal and custodial questions surrounding 8 children, multiple adults, and a network of responsibilities that had clearly collapsed were not going to be resolved in a single night or a single hearing. What was resolved more immediately was the matter of Parucha Phillips herself. She was arrested and booked into the county magistrate's office facing 2 charges of injury to a child by omission. One of those charges carried an allegation of serious bodily injury, a direct reference to the condition of the 3-year-old girl with the broken arm. All 8 children were placed in the care of Child Protective Services, where assessments of their physical and psychological condition could begin. The trial that followed in the years after the initial arrests was detailed and emotionally demanding. Bihar County investigators and prosecutors built a comprehensive case around the evidence gathered from the scene, the medical records of the 2 injured children, and the testimony of multiple witnesses. A video statement from DeAndre Dorch, a man identified as the father of several of the children found in the home, was played in its entirety for the jury, in which he attempted to explain his role in the household, his awareness of the conditions in the backyard, and the life that had been unfolding inside that crowded, chaotic home. The jury heard more than 2 hours of that recorded testimony and weighed it against the physical evidence and the accounts of first responders who had been present on the night of April 29th. Parucha Phillips did not go to trial in the same proceeding. Her case was resolved separately. When the dust settled and the legal process had run its course, Parucha Phillips was sentenced to 50 years in prison for her role in the injuries sustained by the children in her care. 50 years. For a woman who was 34 at the time of her arrest, that sentence is, for all practical purposes, a life sentence. It is the justice system saying, in the clearest terms available to it, that what happened to those children on Chipping Drive, the chains, the leash, the broken bones, the darkness, the crying that a neighbor heard and could not ignore, was not a parenting failure. It was not an oversight. It was not the understandable consequence of poverty or stress or circumstance. It was the deliberate, sustained, ongoing subjection of children to conditions that no child should ever experience, carried out by an adult whose responsibility was their protection. The 2-year-old boy, the 3-year-old girl with the broken arm, the 10-month-old found inside, the 13-year-old old enough to understand. All 8 of them. They all deserved better. They deserved food and warmth and someone who checked on them in the night, not because they were crying long enough to be heard by a stranger, but because they were children, and children deserve to be seen. The neighbor who made that phone call in the early hours of April 29, 2016, made a decision that changed everything for 8 children who could not change it for themselves. That act, that simple, courageous, community-minded act of picking up a phone, is a reminder that all of us are part of the protection system for the children around us. Not just parents, not just teachers, not just caseworkers, all of us. If you ever hear something that does not sound right, if something in your community feels wrong, trust that instinct. Make the call. You might be the difference between a child being found and a child being forgotten. If this case stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Every child who appears on this channel deserves to have their story told, and every subscriber helps make sure that we never stop telling it. Case 5. Candy Dominguez. September 30th, 2014. San Antonio, Texas. Not every case of harm inflicted by a mother is a case of harm inflicted on her own child. Not every story of maternal violence fits the pattern that most people expect when they think of this subject. The case of Candy Dominguez does not fit any easy pattern. It is a story that wins through decades of poverty, abuse, gang involvement, and intimate partner violence before it arrives at a single night in September of 2014, a night that would end with a man's life taken, a family destroyed, and a woman whose name would eventually appear on Netflix's true crime documentary series I Am a Killer, in an episode titled A Mother's Choice. Candice Dominguez, known to everyone in her life as Candy, was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1979. By her own account, her childhood was defined by instability. Her father, she said, struggled with addiction. The home she grew up in was not a safe or stable place. She ran away at the age of 8. By the time she was 15, she was pregnant with her first child. By the time she was an adult, she had been in a long-term relationship characterized by abuse, a relationship that lasted 22 years and produced 5 children. When that relationship finally ended, Candy found herself starting over in the only world she had ever known, the world of San Antonio's streets, where one of the most influential and dangerous criminal organizations in Texas history, the Texas Mexican Mafia, also known as the Mexicaneme, had deep roots going back to its founding in 1984. Into this world, Candy introduced a new relationship, a man named Daniel Moreno Lopez. He was a drug dealer with ties to the Texas Mexican Mafia. He was charismatic in the way that men who live on the edge of danger can be charismatic. And Candy, who had spent decades surviving harm inflicted by people who claimed to love her, found herself in yet another relationship that would ultimately ask her to do something unconscionable. The man who would lose his life on the night of September 30th, 2014, was Jose Luis Menchaca, 35 years old. He was Candy's cousin. And in the complicated, painful geography of Candy's early life, Jose had been one of the people who looked out for her. He had made sure she had food. He had been present in the way that few people in her life had been. Their relationship had been one of kinship and care, until it wasn't. The rupture came through Daniel. Jose and Daniel's history was one of conflict rooted in the dangerous economics of the drug world. Investigators and documentary evidence revealed that Jose had, at some point, physically harmed Daniel during a transaction gone wrong. In the language of the streets that governed their world, that harm demanded a response. And Daniel intended to deliver one, using the one resource he had that Jose would trust completely, Candy. Under false pretenses, Candy invited Jose and his girlfriend, Sylvia, to her home at the 400 block of Hillwood Drive on San Antonio's north side on the night of September 30th. What Jose did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that inside the house, Daniel was waiting. So was Daniel's cousin, Gabriel Moreno. And so were Candy's children, who were present in the home when what followed began. Jose was ambushed inside the house. His girlfriend was separated from him, held in another room, unable to intervene. What followed was a prolonged and brutal attack. Jose was subjected to severe, sustained harm that investigators described as lasting several hours, inflicted with weapons that included baseball bats. He was ultimately deprived of life through strangulation. And then, in the moments and hours that followed, Candy Dominguez made the choices that would define the rest of her life. Investigators documented that she actively participated in the disposal of evidence. She helped separate Jose's remains and attempted to destroy them using a backyard barbecue grill. She assisted in cleaning the crime scene. She helped conceal what had happened in that house on Hillwood Drive for as long as concealment was possible. It was not possible for long. On October 6, 2014, 6 days after Jose Menchaca entered that house and did not leave it, investigators acting on leads discovered remains in trash bags in the garage of the home and on the barbecue pit in the backyard. Candy Dominguez, Daniel Moreno Lopez, and Gabriel Moreno were arrested and charged. The legal proceedings that followed were labyrinthine. Daniel Lopez was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gabriel Moreno's first trial ended in a mistrial in March of 2018. His retrial, concluded in December of 2018, resulted in an acquittal, a verdict that left many observers troubled by the gap between what was known and what could be legally proven. Candy's path through the system was different. She entered into a plea agreement, agreeing to testify against her co-defendants in exchange for a sentence capped at 30 years rather than the life sentence she would otherwise have faced. In December of 2018, she took the stand and testified in extraordinary detail about what she had seen, what she had done, and what Daniel had ordered. Her testimony was clinical and emotionally flat in a way that prosecutors and observers found deeply unsettling. When asked whether she felt remorse, she said, in words that were reported in courtrooms and news outlets and eventually documented in the Netflix series, "At this time, I do not feel remorse. I feel nothing but anger. I'm sorry he lost his life. Yes, but we cannot change things." In February of 2019, Candy Dominguez was formally sentenced to 30 years in prison. She is currently incarcerated at the William P. Hobby Unit in Marlin, Texas, with a projected release date of October 5, 2044, and the possibility of parole as early as October of 2029. The Netflix documentary series I Am a Killer gave Candy Dominguez a platform to tell her story from behind bars, and Season 6 A Mother's Choice explored her case across 2 full episodes, a recognition of its complexity and its refusal to resolve neatly into a simple moral verdict. She portrayed herself as a woman who acted under coercion, under threat, under the long shadow of a lifetime of being harmed by men who claimed authority over her. Whether viewers believed her, whether any of that history constituted an explanation or merely a context, became one of the central questions that the documentary posed. Jose Luis Menchaca was a man with a family. He was 35 years old. He had a girlfriend who survived that night in a locked room, who came out of that house carrying the weight of what had happened inside it. He was someone's cousin, someone who had, in better times, made sure Candy had food. He deserved to walk out of that house on the night of September 30th, 2014. He did not. The case of Candy Dominguez is not a simple story of maternal violence. It is a story about what happens when a lifetime of harm, exploitation, and survival in dangerous environments produces choices that cannot be undone. It is a story about complicity, about the children who were in that house on the night it happened and who grew up carrying what they saw, about a man named Jose who trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment, and about a woman who sat in a Netflix documentary and said, to the camera and to the world, that she did not feel remorse, and what it means to reckon with a statement like that. Justice, in this case, arrived in incomplete pieces. A life sentence for Daniel, an acquittal for Gabriel, 30 years for Candy, and for Jose, a family left to grieve and a story that refused to be buried. If this case made you think, made you feel, or made you want to continue exploring the complexity of true crime and the justice system, this channel is the place for you. Like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Time, leave a comment below, and tell us what you think. We read every single one, and we will keep bringing you stories that challenge, inform, and refuse to look away. Case 6, Wilma Jamitza Medina, September 3rd, 2025, Universal City, Texas. It was not yet 5 o'clock in the morning when Lieutenant Isiosa Ehanire came home from his night shift. He was a police officer with the China Grove Police Department, a man who had spent his working hours responding to the emergencies of others, trained to stay calm under pressure, trained to act when action was needed. Nothing in that training could have prepared him for what he was about to hear inside his own home on Zodiac Drive in Universal City, a quiet community just northeast of San Antonio. He heard a scream. The scream was coming from the direction of the master bedroom. When he reached the door, he found it locked. He broke it open. What Lieutenant Ehanire found on the other side of that door, what he saw in the seconds after the wood gave way and the door swung open, was something that Universal City Police Chief Johnny Siemens would later stand before cameras and describe in a single, devastating sentence. Crimes like this shock your conscience, rock you to your core. His 9-year-old son, David Ogbevbin Ehanire Medina, was lying on the bed, unresponsive. He had been subjected to multiple stab wounds, injuries to both sides of his neck and his torso. His mother, 50-year-old Wilma Jamitza Medina, was there, holding a dagger-style blade. She was also harming herself. Lieutenant Ehanire did what any parent, any person, would have done. He moved toward his son. He struggled with his wife. He managed to wrestle the weapon from her hands and throw it out of reach. He tried to pull her away from the bedroom so he could reach his phone and call for help. And at some point during that desperate struggle in the dark of early morning, Wilma Jamitsa Medina said something to her husband that was captured in the arrest affidavit and repeated in courtrooms and newsrooms across the country. She looked at him and said, "This is what you want." Police officers arrived within minutes of the 911 call. They found Lieutenant Ehanire on the hallway floor, restraining his wife. They found David on the bed with critical injuries and immediately began life-saving efforts. He was transported to Northeast Methodist Hospital, where he was pronounced deceased. Wilma Jamitsa Medina was taken into custody and charged with capital murder of a person under 10 years of age. Her bond was set at $600,000. In the hours and days that followed, investigators and the Universal City Police Department began the process of piecing together what had happened. And more difficult still, why? What emerges from the affidavit, the court filings, and the subsequent media coverage is a portrait of a family that, by outward appearances, had the markers of stability and community. Lieutenant Ehanire was a law enforcement officer. The family lived in a home in a quiet neighborhood. Their son David attended school. There were no prior calls to the Universal City Police Department related to the family, no documented history of domestic disturbance, no prior involvement with law enforcement at that address. Universal City Police officials confirmed that themselves. But the affidavit includes a detail that points towards something beneath the surface, something that investigators identified as potentially critical. According to court records cited by the San Antonio Express News and other outlets, Wilma Medina told investigators that she believed she was being harmed in some way. The precise nature of what she communicated to investigators, the specific content of the beliefs she described, became part of the mental health evaluation that the court ordered in the months that followed. In November of 2025, Wilma Jamitsa Medina was indicted by a Bihar County grand jury on the capital murder charge. In the months following her indictment, a judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation to assess her competency, her ability to understand the legal proceedings against her, and to assist in her own defense. That evaluation was completed and filed in February of 2026, with a finding that she was competent to stand trial. That finding cleared the path for her capital murder case to proceed in district court. She remained in the Bihar County Jail, held on $600,000 bond, as of the time this documentary was produced. In a phone call conducted in Spanish with relatives, a call that was documented and became part of the record of the case, Wilma Medina referred to herself using the Spanish word basura, trash. She expressed shame over her son's passing. Those words, the self-condemnation, the shame, coexist in this case with the reality of what David Ehanire Medina experienced in his own home, in his own bed, in the early hours of a September morning. David was 9 years old. He was the son of a police officer who broke down a locked door trying to reach him. He was a child who had a whole life ahead of him, school and friendships, and the particular, irreplaceable experience of growing up in a family that had both a mother and a father who, by any outward measure, cared about what happened to him. He died in his bed with injuries that left first responders struggling to process what they had seen. Detective Sergeant David Faust of the Universal City Police Department, speaking at a press conference, found words that many others could not. "I don't think that anything could have prepared our first responders of the city for what they saw. It was devastating, and it was very, very, very rough on them." The mental health dimension of this case is real. It is legally significant. It is part of the story, and it will be part of the trial, if and when that trial proceeds. But the mental health dimension of this case does not diminish David. It does not make his loss smaller or his absence less complete. It asks a set of questions about the intersection of severe psychological distress and violence, about the systems that exist to identify and intervene in mental health crises before they reach a breaking point, that courts and communities and mental health advocates will continue to grapple with regardless of how this case resolves. What is clear, in the absence of any other clarity, is this: a 9-year-old boy named David deserved to wake up on the morning of September 3rd, 2025, and go about the ordinary, irreplaceable business of being 9 years old. He did not get that morning. And the people who loved him, his father, who broke down a door to reach him, and who has carried what he found on the other side of it every day since, will live with the weight of September 3rd for the rest of their lives. The pursuit of justice for David Ehanir Medina was ongoing. The case was proceeding. And for those who believe that accountability is not just a legal principle, but a moral one, that the truth of what happened to a 9-year-old boy in Universal City, Texas, deserves to be fully known and fully answered for, the courts of Bexar County were the next chapter. This case is still developing. If you want to stay informed as it progresses, subscribe to Cold Case Time and turn on your notifications. We will bring you updates as the story unfolds. And while you're here, hit that like button, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories. Thank you for being here. David's story matters. Case 7, Elizabeth Escalona. September 2011. Dallas, Texas. Widely archived and broadcast across San Antonio media. There are cases that define a moment in public conversation. Cases that become reference points for an entire community's reckoning with how children are treated within the walls of their own homes by the very people who brought them into the world. The case of Elizabeth Escalona became one of those reference points in Texas in 2012. It is a case that was tried in a Dallas courtroom, sentenced by a Dallas judge, and appealed through the Texas court system. But it was covered extensively by San Antonio broadcast media and became part of the broader Texas consciousness around child protection, parental accountability, and the limits of judicial mercy. Elizabeth Escalona was 23 years old at the time of the events that led to her arrest. She had 5 children. Her youngest, a 2-year-old daughter named Jocelyn Cedillo, was at the center of what happened in September of 2011, an incident that began over something as ordinary and frustrating as potty training difficulties and ended with a child fighting for her life in a Dallas hospital. What Elizabeth Escalona did to her daughter Jocelyn was documented in police records, court testimony, and medical reports that left everyone who encountered them, officers, doctors, jurors, reporters, deeply shaken. According to the testimony of Escalona's other children, who witnessed what happened, their mother attacked Jocelyn because of her inability to use the bathroom appropriately. Escalona kicked her daughter in the stomach. She struck her with a milk jug. And then, in an act that became the defining detail of this case, the detail that was repeated in every news report, every courtroom statement, every discussion of what was done to this child, she applied a powerful adhesive to her daughter's hands and pressed them against an apartment wall. Jocelyn's hands were glued to that wall, and her eyes were glued shut. When she was eventually discovered and brought to a hospital, the injuries she had sustained were extensive. A Dallas police senior corporal named Abel Lopez showed the court, during the sentencing hearing, a bottle of the adhesive taken from the family's apartment. And he showed them something else, a section of wall, removed and preserved as evidence, bearing the small handprints of a 2-year-old girl. Jocelyn had bruising from the top of her head to the bottom of her feet. Hair had been pulled from her scalp. Her forehead, nose, and cheek bore the marks of what had been done to her. Doctors described what appeared to be bite marks on her body. Jocelyn fell into a coma. For 2 days, she was in a coma. She recovered. She survived. She was taken into the care of her grandmother, Ophelia Escalona, who also assumed care of Escalona's other 4 children, including a baby born that same year. That Jocelyn survived, that she came back from a 2-day coma and recovered from injuries that the presiding judge described as placing her at the edge of death, is the one piece of this case that allows for something other than complete grief. Elizabeth Escalona pleaded guilty in July of 2012 to 1 count of felony injury to a child. In pleading guilty, she accepted responsibility for what she had done to her daughter. But the question of how long she would be held accountable, the question of whether her punishment would be measured in months or decades, was left to State District Judge Larry Mitchell, who presided over a week-long sentencing hearing that drew testimony from medical experts, law enforcement officers, family members, and advocates on both sides. Escalona's defense attorney argued that her client had lived a life that amounted to what she called a train wreck. The attorney documented how Escalona had been repeatedly subjected to harm by her father from an early age, had begun using substances before she was a teenager, had her first child at 14, and had consistently found herself in relationships with men who harmed her. She asked the judge not for acquittal. That question was settled by the guilty plea, but for leniency, for consideration, for the recognition that the person standing before the court was herself a product of harm inflicted by others. The prosecution argued differently. Dallas County Prosecutor Aaron Price told the court, "Only a monster glues her daughter's hands to the wall." She played recordings made by Escalona as a teenager, in which she threatened her own mother. She described Escalona's history of gang involvement and substance use, beginning at the age of 11. Judge Mitchell took it all in. He heard the compelling evidence on both sides. And then he handed down a sentence that far exceeded what prosecutors had asked for. They had sought 45 years. The judge gave 99. "To me," he said, "it comes down to a single, salient fact. You savagely beat your child to the edge of death." That statement, direct, unadorned, and final, became one of the most quoted judicial pronouncements in Texas criminal history. It spoke not to Escalona's past, not to her future, not to the tragic arc of her biography. It spoke to Jocelyn, to what was done to her, to the 2-year-old girl who came out of a coma and never got an ordinary childhood back. Elizabeth Escalona filed appeals through the Texas court system. The 5th District Court of Appeals in Dallas reviewed her case and, in February of 2014, affirmed her sentence. The 99-year sentence stood. Under Texas law, she became eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 30 years, meaning she would not be eligible before approximately 2042. The case became a touchstone in Texas legal and advocacy circles, a reference point for discussions about how courts balance the documented history of a defendant's own suffering against the undeniable reality of what they inflicted on a child in their care. It is a balance the justice system was not designed to resolve with elegance or simplicity. But in the case of Elizabeth Escalona, the judge chose the child. He chose the 2-year-old girl with the small handprints on the wall. And 99 years was his answer. Jocelyn Cedillo is alive. She grew up in the care of her grandmother. What she carries from that September, what any child carries when harm like this is done to them in their earliest years, is something the law cannot address, something that therapy and love and time can only partially reach. But she is alive. She survived. And the man who sentenced her mother to 99 years said, in effect, that her survival mattered, that her life had a value that demanded the fullest possible accounting. In Texas, if you are concerned about a child's safety or welfare, you can report it to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services at 1-800-252-5400. Reports can be made anonymously. Every report is taken seriously. Every call could be the one that reaches a child before it is too late. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Cases like Jocelyn's remind us why child advocacy matters, and why this channel will never stop bringing these stories into the light. Case 8. Jessica Briones. September 5, 2017. San Antonio, Texas. There is a kind of horror that arrives not in darkness, but in daylight, not with the chaos of a crisis call or the emergency of a scene in progress, but with the quiet, composed presentation of a mother who walks into a police station with her child and says she needs help. What happens after that arrival, and what is discovered as a result of it, is the story of 4-year-old Olivia Briones, a little girl who weighed less than a child half her age and who had been living a hidden life of suffering inside the home of the one person responsible for keeping her safe. On September 5, 2017, Jessica Briones, 38 years old and the sole caretaker of her 4-year-old daughter Olivia, walked into the San Antonio Police Department's Prue Road substation on the northwest side of the city. She was carrying Olivia. The child was limp. The child was unresponsive. The child was rushed from the substation to University Hospital, where a medical team worked to assess and address injuries that left them alarmed in ways that could not be explained by the story they were being told. Because Jessica Briones had a story. She told investigators that Olivia had slept through her normal waking time and had continued to sleep until around noon. She said the child had then woken up and begun experiencing nausea. She said she had been on her way to get medical help when Olivia stopped breathing entirely. She mentioned an accidental incident, slamming a door on Olivia's arm a few days earlier. She said her daughter fell a lot, that she was clumsy, that the injuries were consistent with a child who stumbled and tripped. The injuries that doctors found at University Hospital were not consistent with a child who fell a lot. They were not consistent with a door-slamming accident. They were not consistent with anything that Jessica Briones told investigators that day or in the hours that followed. Olivia had a subdural hematoma, bleeding inside the skull, between the brain and the surrounding tissue. She had severe swelling of the brain. She had a black right eye. She had fractured vertebrae, broken bones in her spine. She had a deflated left lung. She had injuries to both of her arms that showed obvious deformity, injuries that doctors determined were not new but showed evidence of previous, unaddressed harm. And she had bruises and scars across her body that did not belong to the history of a clumsy 4-year-old child. They belonged to a child who had been subjected to sustained, repeated harm over a period of time that extended well beyond a single incident on a single afternoon. Olivia Briones was the weight of a 2-year-old. She was 4 years old, but she carried the body of a child who had been denied adequate nourishment and whose developmental progress had been impeded by the conditions of her life. She was 4 years old and she had fractures that were in different stages of healing, meaning they had occurred at different times, that harm had come to her more than once, that the injuries in the hospital on September 5th were not a first, but a final chapter. Olivia did not survive. She was pronounced deceased on September 6th, 2017, one day after Jessica Briones carried her through the door of a police substation. Jessica Briones was arrested. She was initially charged with felony injury to a child. In September of 2018, as the full scope of the evidence became clear to prosecutors, that charge was upgraded to capital murder of a child under 10 years of age, the gravest charge available under Texas law for the taking of a young child's life. Her bond was set, and she awaited trial. What followed was a 5-year wait, a legal process that stretched through years of pretrial motions, delays, and procedural developments, a period during which Olivia's memory existed primarily in court records and in the grief of those who remembered her. By the time the trial finally began in October of 2022, more than 5 years had passed since the morning Jessica Briones walked into that substation. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard testimony from medical experts who explained the nature of Olivia's injuries in precise and devastating detail. They reviewed autopsy photographs that reportedly brought jurors to tears in the courtroom. They watched a 5-hour interrogation video in which a San Antonio police sergeant named Rachel Barnes asked Briones question after question about her daughter's condition, and in which Briones responded with explanations that the sergeant directly and calmly refuted. When Barnes told Briones that Olivia's injuries were not consistent with a fall, Briones had no answer. When asked about the head trauma specifically, the injury that would be identified by the medical examiner as the cause of death, Briones said she did not know how it happened. Investigators also executed a search warrant on Briones's home. Inside, they found a bowl of vomit beside the bed where Olivia had slept, evidence that Olivia had been experiencing distress for a period of time before she was brought to the station. That Briones had waited, had delayed, had not sought help sooner, was a question that formed part of the prosecution's case against her. On a Monday in October of 2022, after deliberating for just over 1 hour, the jury returned its verdict. Jessica Briones was found guilty, 1 count of murder, 1 count of injury to a child. The jury took less than an hour to decide. The following day, she was sentenced to life in prison. Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing and spoke directly about Olivia. "This little girl suffered at the hands of her own mother," he said. "She should have celebrated so many milestones." That statement, "she should have celebrated milestones," carries inside it every birthday Olivia never had, every school year she never started, every ordinary Tuesday she never got to live through. She should have. She did not. Jessica Briones will be eligible for parole after serving 30 years of her life sentence. She will be in her late 60s before that possibility arises. The case of Jessica Briones and Olivia is one that child protection advocates, forensic medical professionals, and law enforcement agencies point to as an example of why the detailed forensic examination of children's injuries matters so profoundly, why the presence of fractures at different stages of healing, of injuries that do not match the story being told, of a child who weighs far less than she should, must be taken with maximum seriousness and pursued with maximum urgency. Olivia's injuries told a story that her mother's words attempted to rewrite. The medical evidence refused to cooperate with that rewriting. For Olivia, justice arrived 5 years and 1 month after she took her last breath. It arrived in the form of a life sentence handed down in a Bexar County courtroom while her mother sat and heard it and was taken away. It does not bring Olivia back. It does not restore a single one of the milestones she was denied. But it is the answer the justice system was able to give, and it is the answer that says, clearly and permanently, what was done to you mattered. You mattered, and the person who harmed you has been held to account. If you believe every child's story deserves to be heard and every life deserves to be honored, hit the like button right now, share this video, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We are here every week bringing you the stories that demand to be told. Olivia's story is one of them. Thank you for listening. Case 9, Christina Miranda. September 24th, 2025. San Antonio, Texas. In the language of child welfare and family court, the word guardian carries enormous weight. It means more than a legal designation. It means that a human being, an adult, a person presumed capable of providing protection and love, has accepted formal responsibility for the life and well-being of a child. It means that a court, a system, a society has looked at a situation and said, yes, this person can be trusted to care for this child. This child will be safe here. 10-year-old Michael Miranda had been living with Jonathan and Christina Miranda for 6 years. He was biologically related to Christina, her nephew, and had come into their home as an adopted child when he was around 4 years old. By 2025, the Miranda home on Cielo Ranch on San Antonio's northeast side was his home. It was the place where he had spent the majority of his childhood. The couple had other children in the household as well, at least 4 others, according to neighbors. They were a homeschooling family with ties to their faith community, and the attorney who would later represent Jonathan Miranda described them as people who had extensive support from doctors, church members, and other professionals involved in Michael's care. At approximately 9:20 in the evening on September 24th, 2025, authorities received a call about an unresponsive child at the Cielo Ranch address. When officers arrived, they found 10-year-old Michael Miranda. He was pronounced deceased at the scene. What investigators observed immediately, before any autopsy, before any formal medical examination, were what SAPD homicide detectives described in a police statement as obvious signs of significant trauma. The kind of physical presentation that does not require a medical degree to recognize as inconsistent with natural causes or ordinary childhood injury. The investigation that followed over the next week was thorough, methodical, and ultimately decisive. Detectives worked with the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office to document Michael's injuries in full. What the medical examiner found was a pattern of harm that no single incident could explain. There were fractures, multiple fractures, that appeared to be in different stages of healing. There were contusions. There were signs that, collectively, investigators determined were consistent with continuous trauma inflicted over a period of approximately 1 year. 1 year. Not one incident. Not one terrible moment of lost control or catastrophic failure of judgment. A period of sustained, ongoing harm that stretched across roughly 365 days of Michael's life. Days during which he went to sleep and woke up inside a house that was supposed to be the safest place in the world for him. The arrest affidavit obtained by KSAT included additional details that added layers of profound concern to an already devastating investigation. Investigators noted that Michael Miranda was significantly small for his age, that his physical size and weight were inconsistent with what a healthy 10-year-old should be. The affidavit described signs of possible starvation and malnutrition. When investigators examined the laundry room of the home, they found that it appeared to have been used as a space of confinement, arranged in a way that suggested it had been occupied not for a couple of days, as Christina Miranda claimed, but for a much longer period. The room showed what investigators described as signs of struggle and a form of violence, including broken drywall found inside. People who had been inside the home, individuals identified in the affidavit as corroborating witnesses, told investigators that Michael had been subjected to physical harm on a daily basis. They described methods that included being struck with paddles daily, according to those who lived or spent time in that home. On October 1st, 2025, 1 week after Michael's passing, SAPD homicide detectives and the Street Crimes Unit moved to make arrests. Jonathan Miranda, 34, and Christina Miranda, 32, were taken into custody at a nearby residence. Neither said anything to reporters as officers walked them separately to patrol cars outside public safety headquarters. Both were charged with capital murder. The defense attorney hired by Jonathan Miranda, Joseph Holscher, responded publicly to the arrests with a statement that challenged the conclusions of the investigation. He described Michael as a child with significant pre-existing medical and behavioral challenges, cognitive impairment related to a prior brain tumor, reactive attachment disorder, behavioral patterns that included self-harm. He argued that the evidence cited by SAPD was inconsistent with what CPS had documented and with the experiences of the many people who knew the Miranda family. He described the parents as loving and dedicated, supported by their community, their faith, and their medical providers. That legal defense, the argument that a child's pre-existing conditions explain physical findings that appear consistent with abuse, is a recognized strategy in child abuse prosecutions. It is a strategy that courts and juries are asked to evaluate carefully, weighing the medical evidence against the defense narratives with the full rigor of the criminal standard of proof. It does not mean the claims are true. It does not mean they are false. It means that the determination will be made, as it must be, in a courtroom. What is not in dispute, what the arrest affidavit, the medical examiner's findings, and the statements of corroborating witnesses all establish, is that Michael Miranda's body, when examined, told a story of harm that extended over time and included injuries at different stages of healing. Whether that harm was inflicted by the Mirandas or arose through some other mechanism is the central question that the criminal justice system will be asked to answer. The other children in the home, at least 4 of them, according to neighbors, were placed in foster care through the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services following the arrests. Their well-being, in the wake of losing their brother and having their parents taken into custody, became a secondary but urgent concern for child welfare authorities. Michael Miranda had been through enough before he arrived at the Cielo Ranch home at the age of 4. Whatever the circumstances of his early life that preceded his placement with the Mirandas, the medical history, the behavioral challenges, the conditions that preceded his adoption, none of it changes what he deserved from the people who accepted guardianship of his life. He deserved protection. He deserved nourishment. He deserved to not be in pain. He deserved to be 10 years old and going to bed in a safe room and waking up to a new day. The case was ongoing. The Mirandas remained in the legal system, awaiting trial on capital murder charges. In Texas, capital murder carries a mandatory sentence of either life without parole or the death penalty. The full truth of what happened to Michael Miranda on Cielo Ranch, and in the year of harm that preceded his passing, was a truth that the courts of Bexar County were still working to establish. For Michael, for every child placed in a guardian's care who deserves to be protected and not harmed. This case will be followed on this channel until its conclusion. Subscribe to Cold Case Time, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you've been watching and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. For Michael, for every child whose story deserves to be heard. Case 10, Audie Sanchez. July 26, 2009. San Antonio, Texas. The final case in this documentary is the one that requires the most care in the telling, not because the facts are unclear, but because the space between the facts and any simple understanding of them is wider than almost any other case in this collection. The story of Audie Sanchez is not a story of concealment or deception. It is not a story of calculated harm or sustained cruelty. It is a story of the catastrophic failure of a human mind, of a mental health crisis so severe, so total, so consuming, that by the time it reached its most terrible conclusion, the woman at its center was living in a reality that bore no relationship to the world around her. That does not make what happened to 3-week-old Scott Wesley Buchholz Sanchez any less devastating. It does not make the grief of his father any less real, or the horror of what first responders found on the 300 block of Wayside Drive any less indelible. But it does mean that this case demands a different kind of understanding, not an excuse, but an honest accounting of how and why the systems designed to catch people in crisis failed to do so, and what the cost of that failure was to the smallest, most vulnerable person in the room. Audie Sanchez was 33 years old in the summer of 2009. Her history with mental illness was long, complex, and documented across multiple institutions and providers. From an early age, some evaluations suggested as early as age 5, She had experienced auditory hallucinations. She had a family history of mental illness. Her life had been marked by periods of instability, by harm inflicted on her by others, by a relationship with the baby's father, Scott Buchholz, who was himself a diagnosed schizophrenic taking multiple psychiatric medications. The relationship between two people managing significant mental health challenges, in conditions of instability and limited access to care, produced a pregnancy. And that pregnancy, and the hormonal and neurological shifts that accompany it, acted as what forensic analysts who later examined the case described as a powerful catalyst, a trigger for the most severe psychotic episode of Audie Sanchez's life. The months preceding July 26, 2009, were a cascade of warning signs that were seen and not fully acted upon. In May of 2008, her mother had called police because Audie had gone to Austin and not returned, expressing concern for her daughter's safety. While in Austin, Audie was admitted to Austin State Hospital. Doctors diagnosed her with psychosis. She was given a prescription and discharged. In June of 2008, she was seen at the Center for Healthcare Services in San Antonio, where evaluators found her to be paranoid, mildly delusional, depressed, and experiencing psychotic symptoms, including hallucinations. Her medication was adjusted. She could not afford the adjusted medication. Without the medication, the voices returned. Shortly after going off her medication, Audie Sanchez became pregnant. During the pregnancy, she was referred to counseling for depression but declined to take any prescribed medication, expressing concern about the effects on the developing baby. After the birth of Scott Wesley, the depression deepened. The voices grew louder. 5 days before the events of July 26th, Audie went to a hospital emergency room because the voices were unbearable. She was assessed, given a handout about anxiety, and discharged. On July 20th, 6 days before the tragedy, she was hospitalized briefly and released to her sister. Defense attorney Ed Camara would later note that the antidepressant she had been prescribed took weeks to become effective. She had only taken it the day before the event that changed everything. On the night of July 26, 2009, the voices in Audie Sanchez's mind had been telling her, for days, that the devil was inside her son. She had been avoiding looking into his eyes for fear of what she believed she would see there. The voices had told her that her mother had carried out historical atrocities. The voices had told her that occult forces were conspiring against her. These were not metaphors. These were not exaggerations or figures of speech. They were the literal, experienced reality of a woman in the grip of a psychotic break so complete that it had dissolved the boundary between what was real and what her diseased mind was generating. At some point that night, the voices told her what to do. A 911 call came in from the home on Wayside Drive. On the recording, a woman's voice, Audie's sister, was heard pleading for an ambulance. And another voice could be heard in the background, screaming in grief and terror, and something that was neither one of those things in both of them at once. I didn't mean to do it. He told me to. When officers arrived at the home, they found 3-week-old Scott Wesley Buchholz Sanchez deceased. What they encountered was described by Bexar County District Attorney Susan Reed, a career prosecutor who had seen the full range of human harm, as probably one of the most horrendous cases that we have seen as far as the murder of a child. The details of what occurred in that room are not repeated here in graphic terms. They are part of the court record, part of the documentary record, and part of the permanent memory of every first responder who was present that night. What can be said is that the child Scott Wesley suffered harm that no 3-week-old human being should ever experience, and that his mother, in her delusional state, was present for and responsible for that harm. The subsequent legal proceedings moved along a path that was not typical for a capital murder charge in the state of Texas. 3 independent psychiatric evaluators examined Audie Sanchez. All 3 concluded that she had been legally insane at the time of the incident, that she was suffering from a psychotic episode so severe that she could not distinguish right from wrong, could not have understood the nature of what she was doing in any meaningful legal sense, and that her actions were driven entirely by the delusional framework that her illness had constructed for her. On June 30, 2010, nearly a year after the death of Scott Wesley, Bexar County District Court Judge Raymond Angelini found Audie Sanchez not guilty by reason of insanity. The process took less than 5 minutes, based on a plea entered by defense attorneys and accepted by prosecutors, supported by the unanimous findings of 3 separate psychiatric evaluations. She was remanded to the North Texas State Hospital in Vernon, Texas, subject to annual court review. The baby's father, Scott Buchholz, did not accept this outcome as justice. He was publicly, vocally, and understandably devastated. "She killed my son," he said. "She should burn in hell." Those words, raw, grieving, angry, represented one entirely human response to a verdict that the law required but that the heart refused to accept. His son was dead. The person who harmed his son was in a hospital, not a prison. No verdict, no legal framework, no psychiatric category could provide a father with an answer that made any of that tolerable. Audie Sanchez's aunt visited her in the institution and described her as someone who had fully come to understand what had happened, who missed her son and could not explain why or how. "She misses him tremendously," her defense attorney said on the day of the verdict, a day that would have been the baby's first birthday. The case of Audie Sanchez sits at the intersection of several profound and unresolved questions that American society continues to wrestle with. What does justice mean when the person who caused harm was not, in any recognizable sense, in control of their actions? How do we honor the life of a victim when the framework of criminal punishment cannot apply to the person responsible? And, perhaps most urgently, most preventably, most achingly, what is the cost of a mental health system that identifies people in crisis, provides them with prescriptions they cannot afford, discharges them with handouts about anxiety, and does not follow them back into the world to see what happens next? The Center for Healthcare Services had stopped treating Audie Sanchez due to budget considerations. Metropolitan Methodist Hospital had discharged her 5 days before the worst night of her life with a piece of paper and no follow-up. Multiple points of intervention existed. Multiple opportunities to catch a woman in crisis and hold her there until the crisis passed. None of them were taken. None of them caught her in time. Scott Wesley Buchholz Sanchez was 3 weeks old. He had been held and fed and breastfed by a mother who loved him, before that mother was consumed entirely by the disease that had been building inside her for years. He had been, by his father's account, held gently and cared for in the earliest days of his life. And then he was not. His story is the hardest in this documentary to sit with, not because the facts are more graphic than the others, but because the path to his death was lined with moments where the outcome could have been different, where a prescription refill, a longer hospital stay, a follow-up call from a caseworker might have changed everything. The tragedy of Audie Sanchez is not only what happened to Scott Wesley, it is also what it reveals about the gaps in the systems that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. If you or someone you love is experiencing symptoms of severe mental illness, psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, or severe postpartum depression, please reach out immediately. The National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline is available at 1-800-950-NAMI, that is NAMI, or text the word NAMI to 62640. Postpartum Support International can be reached at 1-800-944-4773. Help exists. Crises can be intervened in. And no one should have to reach a breaking point alone. The 10 cases you have heard across this documentary are 10 different stories, 10 different families, 10 different sets of circumstances, and 10 different legal outcomes. But they share something essential. Children who needed protection. Children who depended entirely on the adults in their lives to provide that protection. Children who, for reasons of cruelty, crisis, illness, or failure of judgment, did not receive what they deserved. This documentary does not celebrate darkness. It does not exist to sensationalize suffering. It exists because these children existed, because they were real, because they had names and faces and brief enough lives that deserve to be witnessed and honored and remembered. It exists because awareness is the first step toward prevention, because understanding the worst of human behavior is part of how we build communities capable of demanding better. And it exists because cold cases, closed cases, ongoing cases, all of them deserve to be brought into the light. To every family member, advocate, investigator, and first responder who fought for any of the children in these 10 cases, thank you. Your work matters. Their lives mattered. Their stories will continue to be told on this channel for as long as this channel exists. If you made it to the end of this documentary, you are exactly the kind of viewer that Cold Case Time exists for. Please take a moment right now to like this video, It tells YouTube's algorithm that this content deserves to be seen by more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new release. Share this video with someone in your life who cares about justice, about children, about the truth. Leave a comment below and tell us, which case affected you most? Which story do you think deserves more public attention? We read every comment. We hear every voice. And we are committed, case by case and story by story, to making sure that the children who pass through this channel are never forgotten. This has been Cold Case Time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. We will see you in the next one.